Hi all. So today we're going to wrap up our course with our final chapter, the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Now you might be wondering if the federal government, as we mentioned last chapter, if the federal government and monetary officials can counteract aggregate demand or decrease in aggregate demand and stimulate output by increasing aggregate demand through fiscal policy and monetary policy, why don't they just do this all the time? And the answer is that fundamentally we have this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And this inflation and unemployment trade-off is captured in something we call the Phillips curve. Now, before we get into this, we need to understand, why is inflation and unemployment so important? Well, they go together to be kind of what we call the misery index. And that's a report that combines the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Now, why do we call this the misery index? Because fundamentally, we believe that inflation and unemployment are both two symptoms that are negatives and contribute to quote unquote misery of laborers in the macroeconomic economy. So, inflation, right? If there's too high of inflation, that means workers, their currency and their wealth is gradually getting less and less and less. However, in contrast, if we have high unemployment, similarly, that means workers are worse off. They're not able to find employment. So to trace this relationship, a guy by the name of A.W. Phillips created the Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve was a curve that shows the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And again, its origins are in A.W. Phillips, who wrote a near 100-year history tracing the relationship between employment, unemployment, and inflation throughout the United Kingdom's history, since like 1865 to 1951. It's a very sweeping work. And the information Phillips discovered came back and was supported by two other economists, Samuelson and Robert Solow. Now, if we zoom in here, we can see exactly how the Phillips curve looks. Is it simply a depiction of the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation rate? And when we say inverse, what we're saying is that as one goes up, the other goes down. So basically, if we have a high unemployment rate, like at point A, so say an unemployment rate of 7%, you have a low inflation. Similarly, if you have a medium level or a lower level of unemployment, then inflation rate should also be higher at about 6%. And so the Phillips curve simply traces all of these possible combinations of outputs and basically is a general summary of the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Now, what does this mean for aggregate demand, aggregate supply? Well, the Phillips curve shows the combinations of inflation and unemployment that arises in the short run as shifts in the aggregate demand curve move the economy along the short run aggregate supply curve. So if we traced over here, for example, notice that if aggregate demand shifted rightward, so say point A is the equilibrium in a low aggregate demand, or at least a lower aggregate demand period, where unemployment is 7% and the price level is 102, if aggregate demand shifted rightward, this would mean a lower unemployment rate and a higher output. So output is now 16,000, unemployment is now 4%, but the correspondence is that we have an increase in the price level to 106 from 102. So the idea here is that we can see there is a tracing where we have a trade-off of reducing unemployment comes at the cost of a higher price level. And that's exactly what we see traced over here at the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve simply tracks these changes in unemployment along with these changes in price level, and it gives us this downward sloping curve. Now, expectations plays a vital role in the Phillips curve. And basically, the long story short here is we found during the 1970s is that the Phillips curve doesn't necessarily hold true in all cases. In fact, there were periods of stagflation where we had unemployment, higher unemployment, and high inflation. And to explain this problem, Milton Friedman and his co-writer Phelps introduced the concept of the long-run Phillips curve. And the long-run Phillips curve argues that in the long run, there's no trade-off between employment and inflation. This leaned on the classical theory we discussed in chapters 16 and 17, the idea that there's a difference between real variables and nominal variables, and that inflation is a nominal issue. And so in this strategy, in this theory, Fed can target nominal interest rates, the money supply, but not real variables. In practice, this means the long-run Phillips curve is vertical as the economy returns to the natural rate of unemployment. And again, this is simply the expression of the classical idea of monetary neutrality. That is, that money has no effect on real values. And so if we zoom in here, we can see what this results in. The long run Phillips curve, figure 3 in this chapter in your text, states that when the Fed increases the growth rate of the money supply, the rate of inflation increases from a low inflation to a higher inflation. But since unemployment remains at its natural rate in the long run, that means that the natural rate of unemployment remains unchanged. So, again, we mentioned in an earlier chapter, we looked at how increases the money supply spur aggregate demand, but the long run aggregate supply rate doesn't change, meaning that overall the price levels must rise and the money supply similarly rises. What the long Phillips curve shows us is that in this case, what we find is that the Fed increasing the growth rate of money simply leads to higher inflation without a long-term significant impact on the unemployment rate. Now, we can take the long-run Phillips curve and then compare this to aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to see some other results of this or other implications. So in the long run, if aggregate demand increases for, say, due to a money supply increase, we shift from point A to point B, which means that we now have a higher price level, and that higher price level corresponds to an increase in the inflation rate along the long-run Phillips curve, even though the natural level of unemployment rate is at its natural rate. So again, the simple idea here is that what Phelps and Friedman discovered was the Phillips curve in the long run has no real impact, which means that if the Federal Reserve was just to keep pumping money into the economy, we ultimately would not expect it to reduce unemployment in the long run. We simply expect it to create more inflation. So there's some key thoughts to keep in mind when you're considering the long-run Phillips curve. What is the meaning of natural? Well, natural is just used to explain the rate that the economy gravitates to in the long run, but it can be shifted by policies such as government jobs or unions. Similarly, we have the question of how do we reconcile theory and evidence? Friedman and Phelps' argument is theoretical and it's based upon classical theory. But Phillips, Samuelson, and Solow derived their argument based upon empirical evidence. That is, they collected a bunch of data points on the relationship between inflation and unemployment. So to adjust for this and explain this empirical and theoretical gap, Friedman and Phelps introduced a new concept to the analysis of the inflation-unemployment trade-off, and that is expected inflation. And this argument contended the Fed's ability to create inflation by increasing the money supply only exists in the short term because people can catch on to that strategy and adjust their decisions in the long term, limiting the effectiveness of unintended or unexpected inflation. Now, the short run's Phillips curve, Friedman and Phelps offered a interesting equation for summarize the unemployment relationship to inflation. So the unemployment rate can simply be explained as the difference between the natural rate minus A, which is some fixed variable, times the actual inflation rate minus expected inflation. And remember, the reason we considered actual inflation and expected inflation is this is getting at the idea that employers base their hiring based upon what they expect in price changes to be. And if the expected inflation rate is actually higher than the actual inflation rate, this means that firms would have overspent on labor and they would have overcommitted finances, which would reduce their ability to hire employees. Now, this equation reveals there's no stable short-run Phillips curve. We find that it intersects with a long-term curve at the expected inflation rate, and when those expectations shift, the curve follows to reestablish the long-term rate. This means that the Phillips curve should not be understood as a menu of options to be embraced. In effect, it doesn't work. You want this much unemployment, you have to pay this much in inflation. And that's important, right? Because this means the government can't sit here and be like, well, we're willing to pay 4% inflation to get 3% unemployment. The answer is no. This is just expressing that there is a sequence of relationships and a series of outcomes, and that actually you could have a much higher level of inflation to reduce even a lower amount of unemployment. So the natural experiment for the natural rate hypotheses, which this is the claim kind of performed by Friedman and Phelps, and that was the claim that unemployment eventually returns to its normal or natural rate regardless of the rate of inflation. Let's consider figure 6. The Phillips curve came about in the 1960s, and if you look at the short-term Phillips curve, it actually looks exactly like Phillips explained. We see that when inflation is higher, there's lower unemployment, and when unemployment increases, there is a lower inflation rate. So it seems good for the Phillips curve in the short run. However, in the 1970s, we get a very different example because while we still see these data points from the 60s, the 1970s actually added this stagnant spiral. And in fact, what we see is this idea that it is returning to this natural rate of unemployment, that you can put a vertical line there, and that balances out these fluctuations we're seeing in the Phillips curve. Now, supply shocks play a key role in determining the effects on inflation. And just note, a supply shock is an event that directly alters firms' costs and prices, thereby shifting the economy's average supply curve and thus the Phillips curve. There's two examples we can readily think of. The most recent, the effects of COVID-19, where firms had to institute a ton of restrictions on labor and employees, while at the same time instituting even stricter cleaning policies. The example that Friedman responded to in the 1970s, however, was the oil crisis. And the long story short here is that due to the Western support for Israel, OPEC, a largely ensemble of Middle Eastern nations, embargoed the United States and several other Western countries and refused to export oil to them. But the results of this oil shock, though, meant that ultimately a lot of products went up in price, and there was a significant contraction in the aggregate supply curve. And so we had an adverse shift in aggregate supply, which lowered our output and raised the price level. So at a lower output and a higher price level, we get what we call stagflation. And if we come over here and trace the outcome of this to the inflation rate, we see that policymakers faced a less favorable trade-off between unemployment and inflation. What this means is that even higher inflations would be required to reduce even modest amounts of unemployment. The cost of reducing inflation can be modeled as follows then, and just note that disinflation are policies intended to reduce the price level. If you use a contractionary policy to slow down the economy and to reduce inflation, what we find is that this actually is amounting to spiking the unemployment rate. All right, so the long-run Phillips curve starts at A, we're at a high inflation rate. To bring inflation under power, you effectively have to contract the money supply. And contracting the money supply, of course, reduces aggregate demand. And when it reduces aggregate demand, what this means is that in the short term, we have a huge spike in unemployment because the short-run Phillips curve is also informed by the high expectation of inflation. But the short-run Phillips curve then returns to point C as it adjusts with lower inflationary expectations. So in the long run, expected inflation falls and the short-run Phillips curve shifts left, meaning that we have successfully created a lower inflation rate. This is exactly what happened in the late 1970s when the Fed chair by the name of Paul Volcker took an aggressive action and policy response to reduce the monetary supply to fight off dramatic increasing inflation. But the cost of reducing inflation can be modeled through what we call the sacrifice ratio, and that is the number of percentage points of annual output lost in the process of reducing inflation by 1 percentage point. Note, percent is different than percentage point. We're not saying 1% of inflation. We're saying 1 percentage point of inflation. But ultimately, what the sacrifice ratio then is, it suggests the idea that how much are we willing to pay in output to reduce inflation. Now, there's an interesting theory here called rational expectations and the possibility of costless disinflation. And the rational expectation school is the theory that people optimally use all the information they have, including information about government policies, when forecasting the future. The guy that created this idea is the name by Thomas Sargent, and he wrote a paper in 1981 called The End of the Four Big Inflations. And Sargent's idea was that if government committed to low inflation, private agents, such as you and I, would then expect inflation to remain low, adjust our expectations, and then disinflation would be relatively painless with a low, if not zero, sacrifice ratio. But the key here is it has to commit and set expectations. Now, why do we have so much debate over this? Well, let's just consider what has happened to the Federal Reserve monetary policy over time. We mentioned Paul Volcker and the Paul Volcker disinflation in 1970s the 1970s were marked by rapid inflation, and Volcker single-handedly brought it down from 10% to 4%. That is a 60% reduction in the amount of inflation rate. This was a huge success, but unemployment increased rapidly at the price. However, this employment increase was not as dramatic as expected. So the reason why disinflation was unexpected, meaning they could capture the benefit, meaning that employers had built-in expectations of a higher wage rate and then found themselves actually surprisingly paying less. Importantly, this means that citizens should not be presumed to take policy announcements seriously. Seems reasonable, right? Now, the next era was the Greenspan era, and this was a mostly stable period. The Fed paid attention and adjusted policy as expected, reduced money supply when the economy did not need it, and expanded when necessary. Although there are some arguments that at the tail end of the Greenspan era, the Fed was too generous and left interest rates too low for too long, and perhaps led to the 2008 financial crisis. Which brings us to the financial crisis of 08 and 07, 07, 08. And at this time, Ben Bernanke was the Fed chair throughout the Great Recession, and then followed by Janet Yellen. And these two coordinated to take dramatic monetary action. But inflation remained stable even as unemployment rate rose, which leads us to questions of what allowed this to happen. Was it the United States reputation? Was it the commitment and reputation of the Federal Reserve and their monetary policy? We don't know. And this is one of the current trends and current debates that monetarists and the Federal Reserve and economic commentators are discussing daily. And I want to wrap up. These are huge topics. The fate of economies rests in them. How we answer them, how we solve them, how we believe they work, these drive economic policy today. You've heard of other suggestions kind of coming out of the woodworks. Some are orthodox, such as real business cycle theory. Others have come from heterodox places and are trying to rewrite economics as we know it, which are modern monetary theorists. There's a lot of debate here, and it's crucial we get this right, because if we get it wrong, we can get dramatic consequences like the Great Depression. Now, to tell you how big this topic is, 5 of the scholars discussed in this chapter, Paul Samuelson, Robert Solow, Lucas, Thomas Sargent, and Milton Friedman, have all won Nobel Prizes in economics for their work on this exact topic. It's a huge topic. But now you know the basics of the debate over combating recessions. And in the future, my hope is that if you walk away from this class, the one thing you'll know is what kind of questions do you need to be asking when a recession happens or when there's talk of recession? What are you getting told? Is it accurate? Do you have questions about it? Consider, let it know. But that's it for all. Enjoyed the semester. I hope you did too. Take care, all.